Good morning, class. Today we're going to be looking at while loops note 1. And in this video, I'm going to introduce you to the concepts of while loops and do while loops. Okay, so first off, let's revisit a concept that you are very familiar with because we've been doing it since Unit 2, which is if statements. So an if statement runs on some sort of condition. Now, condition's just something that's going to yield a Boolean or true or false. And if the condition is true, whatever code's inside these braces is going to run. Now, I do that demonstration because while loops is basically the exact same idea. Instead of if, this is while. So while condition. If this condition's true, it's going to run the code that's in these braces. If the condition's false, it's going to bypass and go to the next line of code after the while loop. The only difference between a while loop and an if statement is an if statement, once it's run through the code once, it moves on. A while loop, it runs through the code, and then once it reaches the end, it goes back and checks the condition again. And if the condition's true, it runs through the code again, and it keeps doing this. Every single time it runs through the code, it goes back, checks the condition. If the condition's still true, it runs the code again. So it's going to keep doing this over and over and over again. Eventually, that condition's false, bypasses the code, and runs whatever happens after the while loop. So that's how a while loop works. Now, a do while loop is very similar. The main difference between a do while loop and a while loop is on a do while loop, we run through this code at least once, no matter what. After we run through the code, we get to the while loop. If the condition's true, it goes back to the do and runs it again. If the condition's false, it just keeps going. So on a while loop, whatever code's in these braces will only run if this condition's true. So this code might not ever run because when you check the condition the first time, it may be false. Versus a do while loop, it runs through this code once. If the condition's true, it goes back and run it again. If the condition's true, it does it again. So a do while loop always runs through that code at least once. All right, so let's look at some examples code-wise of this in action. In previous units, if we were asking the user to enter in some sort of number, like enter a number from 1 to 4, we could use an if statement to determine whether it was a valid entry or not. But if it was an invalid entry, there's really nothing else I could do with it. But now, with while loops, what I can do is make sure the user enters in a valid number. And it's going to keep asking the user to re-enter their number until it's valid. So here this example, I ask the user to enter a number from 1 to 4. And so I input that as x. If x is less than 1 or x is greater than 4, so in other words, it's not a valid number, I tell the user, hey, that's not a valid entry, try again. And it's going to allow the user to enter in a number. So I can't get out of this while loop unless I enter in some number that's valid, which would be 1, 2, 3, or 4. And once I enter 1, 2, 3, or 4, this while loop will stop because this condition would no longer be true. And so this no longer allows the user to input invalid entries and stop. Instead, if the user inputs an invalid entry, it'll just keep repeating until the user enters in what they're supposed to enter. So let's look at another example. This is the same problem, but now in a do while loop format. So instead of having input and then more input inside the while loop, since a do while loop always runs at least once, I can just go ahead and do all my input inside the do while loop. So look, No matter what, this is going to run once. So I ask the user input a number 1 through 4. If it's less than 1 or greater than 4, it's invalid. So I print out, hey, error, number must be 1 to 4. And then I hit this while loop. If I entered a valid number, something from 1 to 4, this while condition is false. Therefore, I'd keep going. But if I entered something that was invalid, such as the number 7, well, 7's greater than 4, so true or it's true. If the while loop's true, I go back to the do and run through this code again. If you're doing user input, doing a do while loop is better than a while loop, because if you're doing user input, you're going to have the user input at least once. So a do while loop makes sense, because remember, with a do while loop, the code always runs at least once. And there we go. There's our basic examples of how while loops work. You'll discover as you use these are easier than for loops, because it's just a simple little condition. Thank you very much and have a good day.